Last Wednesday, we began a new journey together, and we're part of a large group of churches that decided to do this program together called If My People. And it's the concept that all of us Christians in the Bay Area, we're going to gather together on Wednesdays, and we're going to pray, and we're going to fast. It's based off of 2 Chronicles 7:14, which reads this way: If my people, who are called by my name, will humble themselves and pray, and seek my face, and turn from their wicked ways, then here's what God's going to do. I will hear from heaven, and I will forgive their sin, and will heal their land. So on Wednesdays, here's what we decided. We want to gather and fast and pray. And we're going to be gathering just digitally. I mean, shut down your social media and also shut down your eating. So from sunup to sundown, we are focused on praying and talking to God. And so I would just invite you to join us and do that. We started that last Wednesday. We'll continue this Wednesday. We'll send you an email on Tuesday reminding you of that. So here's our final week in our honor series. We've been asking the question, what does it mean to be a person of honor? If we're going to honor God and be a person of honor, what are the criteria that God has for us? So to wrap up this series, I think today might be actually the most important Sunday in this, because I want to talk about the dark side of honor. See, honor has a twin. Honor has a twin that, they're inseparable. They're linked together. They come as a pair. See, honor is fantastic, but honor's twin causes an awful lot of problems for us. Honor's twin is named shame. You can't technically have honor without shame. Here's why. When you have a society that values honor, there's an honor code that goes with that. And when we violate that code of honor, what are we left with? Not honor, but shame. So you can't have a people of honor and a code of honor without having shame. It's just a part of it. Shame is not just limited to you, but the reality is this. Our decisions and our choices, or other people's decisions and choices, could actually bring shame on our family, friends, church, our parents. And I know for some people, this is your reality. You grew up in a family that was very much about honor. And you can't have a family that values honor highly without having this shame concept as well. So what is shame and where does it come from? Let's take a look back. In Genesis, God creates man and woman with honor because he creates them in his very image. What that means is it's only people who could have this distinct relationship with God. Nothing else on earth does. It's only people who are given this code of honor. What's the code of honor? Enjoy it all, except don't eat from those trees over there. It's only people who were created in God's image. Only people who could have this distinct relationship with God. And in Genesis 2:25, it says, Adam and his wife were both naked, and they felt no shame. When God created this, there was no shame between them. Enjoy it all, but just don't eat from that tree. And it doesn't take long for Adam and Eve to violate that code of honor. And it says this: Then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they realized they were naked, so they sewed fig leaves together and made a covering for themselves. So what is shame? Shame is the feeling of regret, remorse, and embarrassment because our behavior violated our honor or the honor of our community. And make note of this too, because sometimes we feel shame not because we did something wrong. That was the case with Adam and Eve. But sometimes there's a community that they hold a standard for us that they want us to live up to. You should get that job. You should have that career. You should get into that school. And that's their standard of honor. But we didn't make it. We didn't get in. We didn't choose that career. And there's this sense of regret, remorse, embarrassment. By the way, those are all technical things, right? But we all know what shame is kind of intuitively. It's when you remember that experience and your heart rate goes up. Maybe your hands get a little sweaty. The anxiety just creeps in, and there's just this sense of, that memory makes me feel awkward, bad, or ashamed. And so we want to ask this question today. If you're a Christian, you've been forgiven by Jesus, so what do we do with our shame? Here's the question: how can we unhitch shame from our sense of honor? Let me give you the first thing. It's this. The first is admit how shame causes us to hide. And if you're filling in the blanks, there it is. Admit how shame causes us to hide. When Adam and Eve sinned, here's what it says. Adam says, I heard you in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, so I hid. Here's what's interesting about shame. It's a universal experience. It kind of transcends cultures. Some cultures, Middle East, Asian, heavy doses of honor, right? But also heavy doses of shame. But it's interesting because shame actually comes from the very first man and woman that walked the earth, which means this: it's a universal problem. It's a universal problem that we all hide. Here's what's interesting. Jesus steps into the world, and I'm just going to tell you 3 stories about 3 people who are actually hiding because of their shame. The first is found in John chapter 4. He meets this woman at the well, and here's where she's hiding. She's hiding in relationships. And Jesus comes to the well. It's the middle of the day, the hot part of the day, and she's coming to the well, and he's there. Why is a woman coming to the well all by herself in the heat of the day when she could come in the morning, chat it up with her girlfriends, and it could just be a good community event? Because in her community, she's a person of shame. It doesn't take long. Jesus reveals her story. Hey, I just know this about you. The 5 guys you've been with, they're not your husbands, and the guy that you're shacking up with right now, he ain't your husband either. Jesus just pulls out all the shame, lays it right there on the table. This woman, first of all, she's hiding by avoiding people. But second, I think she's hiding in her relationships. She's gathering men around her who will give her approval, get something for her, but not criticize her. She's hiding by the acceptance of men. But she's no different than we are, right? Before we start sounding too critical of her, we hide behind our number of followers. We find friends or crowds of people that agree with us, like us, accept us, and don't judge us, which means this: they could be just accepting our very dishonorable behavior. Instead of being concerned about what might honor God, we really deeply value being honored by people so that we can have a group that we call, those are my people. So if she's hiding in relationships, Jesus meets another person by the name of Zacchaeus who is hiding in his success. Zacchaeus, you might know this story. He's a short guy behind a big crowd. He can't see Jesus, so he climbs a tree. Jesus comes by him. He says, Zacchaeus, get down here. I need to go to your house today. Here's how Luke describes him in chapter 19. Zacchaeus was a chief tax collector, not just a tax collector, but a chief tax collector, and he was wealthy. He didn't earn that wealth or that title, chief tax collector, by honest means. It says this: all the people saw this and began to mutter, Jesus has gone to be the guest of a sinner. Listen, he carries all kinds of shame, Zacchaeus does, in his culture, because of his career and how he's been dishonest. But it's so interesting because in the middle of this lunch where Zacchaeus shows up and brings Jesus to his house, by the way, Jesus is honoring him, showing him honor even though he's not a man of honor. Jesus does that for us. Zacchaeus has his turning point. He says, look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor, and if I cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount. This is a turning point for this man. The story ends with Jesus declaring, today salvation has come to this house. Zacchaeus, he's hiding in his wealth. Because the reality for a lot of cultures is this: you actually can buy friends. You can buy people who will be with you, not judge you. They might want something from you. But your wealth, maybe even in some cultures, can buy you respect. The thing it can't buy you, though, is this: honor, really honor from God. There's a third person that I want to take a look at in Luke 8. Jesus is being rushed off to a house because there's a young girl who's dying. Someone comes and gives a report, there's a girl dying. Jesus, you got to come and heal her. But there is a woman who wants to remain anonymous. Here it is, number 3. She's hiding in anonymity. She reached out and she touches Jesus, and Jesus, stop. Somebody just touched me. And his disciples think he's a little bit off. He's like, Jesus, there are people touching you all over the place. Everybody's touching you. The crowds are coming in. He goes, no, I felt someone touch me. Power went out from me. And then it says this: then the woman, seeing that she could not go unnoticed, and that's what she wanted. See, what had been happening, this woman, her insides were all messed up. The scripture pretty much says this: she'd been having a period for 12 years. In her society, she is unclean. There is shame that goes along with that. Listen, there's some moments in your life, this disease that she had is to no fault of her own, but she's experiencing shame in the culture. She can't remain anonymous, though. Jesus won't allow it. Instead, she's healed instantly, and Jesus calls her out. By the way, do you know why? It's not to increase the shame. It's so that everybody around her can understand her cleanness, her faith, and he tells her, go in peace. Now that everyone knows that, she goes home as a hero of the faith, and the community can wrap their arms around her. But she's trying to hide in anonymity. 3 people, all hiding their shame, but they aren't the only ones, right? I mean, people by nature, they hide their shame. We hide in our homes, our nice cars, our offices. We hide behind our diplomas, our physiques, and our fashion. We hide in our yard work, our garages, and our hobbies. We hide behind our screens, Netflix, and ESPN. We hide behind our social media. We hide behind career accomplishments, religious badges. We hide in busyness and procrastination. Sometimes we hide by just flat out lying and deceiving or trying to remain invisible. We hide behind our humor, and we also hide behind our anger. We hide behind our fear, and we also hide behind our false bravado. Shame makes us hide. There's not a unique one among us. Shame is a universal experience. So can I just ask you this question in all honesty? Where do you hide? Would you be bold enough to maybe write it down? The place that you hide to try and get honor, particularly when you're feeling this shame. So number 2, to unhitch shame from our lives, we first need to admit how we hide. The second is this: recognize how contagious shame is. Dan DeWitt is a writer for the Gospel Coalition. He writes this. He says, guilt is usually tied to an event. I did something wrong. Shame is tied to a person. It's not that I did something wrong. It says I am bad. Guilt is the wound. Shame is the scar. Guilt is isolated to the individual. Then he writes this: shame is contagious. You'll see this in your notes. He writes, no one can share in your guilt, but many can share in your shame. And then he gives examples. The child whose father is imprisoned, the wife whose husband is unfaithful, the daughter whose mother is abusive. They all share in the shame. They feel their self-worth is lessened. Shame wraps its arms around their ankles tightly, allowing them to walk but never run. I just want you to get this, that shame can be contagious. My question is, who passed it on to you? Was there a person or an event in your life that maybe was to no fault of your own that passed on shame to you because of their actions? Let me ask a different question. If you did not live a life of honor, who could you pass on shame to? I ask that question not to increase the intensity of shame, but if you understand the contagious nature of it, maybe we don't want that for our spouse, for our kids, for our parents. And the concept is maybe that will cause us to live different. First, where do we hide? The second, how contagious is it? Here's the third. If we're going to unhitch shame from our life of honor, it's this: look to Jesus to alleviate not only guilt, but shame. If you're a Christian, you get it. Jesus forgives us. But do you know that Jesus actually releases us from shame? There's multiple places in the Bible where I could look to this. But let me read to you. This is Romans chapter 10. If you declare with your mouth Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. And that's no news to you if you're a Christian. But verse 10, for it's with your heart that you believe and are justified. It's with your mouth that you profess your faith and are saved. But then it says this in verse 11. And the scripture says, anyone who believes in him will never be put to shame. We're not only forgiven, but that shame is erased and it is gone. This is important to know. In the Greek text, there's different words that our English still translates as the word shame, but they use different words in Greek. See, there's this one that says shame it's this disgrace that you feel because you're judged before God, judged as guilty, judged as not worthy of being saved. But then there's this other Greek word. You no longer have the guilt of your sin, but it's this innocence that you have. The problem is that there's a word about shame that is about regret and feeling guilty. Here's the problem with shame. The problem with shame, it's like a dry erase board. Have you written on a dry erase board, right? We all have. You wrote on there, and the longer you left the text on the board, before you tried to wipe it out? When you go to wipe it out, if it was on there for any length of time, no matter how much you wipe, you could still, if you stare at it, you can see what was written on there. And often that's our hearts, right? Okay, Jesus, you forgive me. So he erases the dry erase board. But man, when you look at it, you can still see it. Can I say this? You're the only one who's looking at your dry erase board of your life going, I know I was forgiven and it was erased, but I can still read it. God can't read it. When he sees us, he looks at us with the innocence of his son. So here it is. Jesus alleviates not only guilt, but shame also. So when those memories arise, here's what it is. You need to fight with truth. And remind yourself that God erased not just your guilt, but your shame. Here's number 4. If you're going to unhitch shame from your honor, embrace the helpfulness of shame. What? Shame can be helpful? How is that? If it's that Greek word that is about your unworthiness, then it's not helpful. But there are moments where shame is about the mistakes that we have made. Listen to this. 1 Corinthians 15:34, Paul writes to this church. Now, granted, this was a messed up church, okay? He says, come back to your senses as you ought and stop sinning. For there are some who are ignorant of God. And then he writes this, I say this to your shame. Is he saying, I say this because you guys are lousy and you're not worth the time I spent with you? I'm trying to heap shame on you? No. He's trying to raise regret and sorrow in them so that they will come back to God and say, God, we once asked for forgiveness, but man, we are not living for you right now. So God, I'm coming back to you. So shame can be helpful. It's helpful if it's this emotion or this feeling that says, you know what? I haven't honored God, even as a Christian. And not take it lightly, but to say, God, would you forgive me? Shame can be unbelievably useful if it drives us back to God. Shame actually gets destructive, though. Mark my words in this. It gets destructive if it's the kind that can form when it's the emotion of shame sits in us too long. It becomes a part of our identity, and you don't think you can change, and you begin to feel worthless. I want to finish by reading Hebrews chapter 12. Hebrews chapter 12, the first 3 verses, if you open your Bibles and you're there, I want you to just soak in this. And maybe this week as you're with God and you're doing your devotions, just sit in Hebrews chapter 12. Here's how it reads. Therefore, since we are surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of faith. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinners, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. Let me put my finger on a handful of things from these verses that I notice about how do you get rid of this crippling shame. Number 5, I believe it's about engaging in a transparent, grace-filled community because shame can't survive there. Shame has a kryptonite. And the kryptonite to shame is if it is brought out in a transparent way to say, this is really who I am. Not the fake me, not the facade me, but this is really who I am. And there's a community of God's people that will wrap their arms around you and they will love you despite who you are. Paul begins this by saying, therefore, since we're surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses, listen, you're not in this alone. There are people who have gone before you in this faith and passed on. There's also Christians who are available to you today. Do you belong to that kind of grace-filled community? I know the temptation is to hide, but hiding just keeps you in shame. He goes on to say this, let us throw off everything that hinders. And then he says this, and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us. So there's sin, things we do that are wrong, that we should have regret for, and come to Jesus and say, Jesus, forgive me. But then there's some things that just hinder us. Can I just tell you, shame's one of them? Shame's one of those things that it just grabs onto us and just doesn't let us run the race that God has for us. With that in mind, Let me say this, number 6. Keep short accounts with God, because shame easily entangles us and creates a cycle of destructive behavior. When I say keep short accounts with God, listen, if you stepped out in a way that just said, I'm wrong, come to God and just say, God, forgive me. Just know that he takes you back. But if there are things in your life that maybe they're not even sin, they're just holding you back, keep short accounts with God and recognize, God, this shame I'm feeling, this experience that I'm having that I don't feel like I'm actually living the life you want for me, bring it to him and let him talk to you about it. I think it's one of the reasons why we send our daily devotions to you every day. We need short accounts with God, that he's actually with us all the time. And then he says, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. In your life, I guarantee we all think about ourselves more than we think about Jesus. So let me say it this way. Keep your focus on the identity that Jesus gives you and the road ahead. The focus isn't on us. It's not looking at our dry erase board that has the list of all the things that we've ever done wrong. You can do that if you want to, but you're going to live with a sense of shame. He's created you for something wonderful. Ephesians says that he's made you a masterpiece, created you for good works. What are those good works? What is that thing that he's created you for? And if you don't know, get out there. Focus on this identity that he has given you and look at the road ahead. He wraps up with this. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross. And then he writes this, scorning its shame. Jesus scorned the shame of the cross. And then he sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinners, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. When it says Jesus scorned the shame, that death on the cross was designed to be the public, most painful, most humiliating, most shame-filled way that a person could die. It was so shame-filled and so painful that a Roman citizen was not actually allowed to be crucified. They would keep their people from that because it was too shameful. Jesus, not being a Roman citizen, he goes through all of the shame of being publicly whipped, stripped of all of his clothes, and nakedly hanging on a cross to die. And the scripture says, scorning its shame. Jesus' focus was this: above all else, my job is to honor God. He's my Father. I want to be honored by him, not necessarily by these people. And so he went through this shameful experience, scorning its shame, which means this: disregarding it, pushing it aside, going through it anyways, knowing that he would rather be honored by God and enduring shame from people than trying to be honored by people. And he did that for us. So here's number 8. Honor the one who honored you with his son's life. And don't sweat the shamers. You're going to have people in your life who try to heap shame on you. But keep your eyes fixed on Christ. He's given you a new identity, a new cause, a new purpose for living. Let me wrap up with just a quick story. In 1981, there's a man by the name of Bill Broadhurst. He entered this race called the Pepsi Challenge. It was a 10K race in Omaha, Nebraska. Surgery 10 years earlier to correct an aneurysm left him paralyzed on his left side. On that July morning, he stood with 1,200 other athletes at the start line. The gun sounds, the crowd surges forward, and Bill runs. But because he's paralyzed on his left side, he throws his stiff leg forward and then pivots with his foot on the other one and does this. And that's Bill's race. Pretty soon, the crowd is way in the distance. They've left him behind. Sweat is rolling down his face. Pain pierces his ankle. 4 miles in, he's just done. He just wants to quit. Why would I do this? I'm the last one. In about 30 minutes, the winner crosses the line of the race. Hour After hour goes by, 2 hours, 29 minutes later, Bill reaches the finish line. The banners are gone. There are no spectators. But out from a tent comes a man. And he grabs a banner and stretches it across the finish line. The guy's name was Bill Rogers. He was the famous marathon runner. Bill Rogers was in the race. Bill Rogers ran that race and won. And he shows up at the finish line for Bill Broadhurst to welcome him. And when Bill Broadhurst crossed that line, Bill Rogers takes the medal from the race and puts it around the neck of this guy who finished last. Why? Because he ran with perseverance. Can I just say this? Every single one of us runs with a limp. Every single one of us has something in life that we feel shame over. Either someone's shaming us or we're causing shame on ourselves. And so we have this limp. And it's how we run. It's the life that we have. And as much as we want to get rid of it, can I just say, it's not about running without a limp. It's about running the race that God has given you and persevering. Because at the end of that race, God waits for you. He's been with you all along, but he waits for you to give you this award that says, well done, good and faithful servant. So don't let shame stop you from running the race that God's given you, even if you're running with a limp. I want our band to come up here right now. I'm going to have them sing a song that you will listen to and just be a part of. As they come up, though, I want this to be a time where you start thinking about these two questions. Have you received the gift of forgiveness that Jesus offers? If you're not a follower of Christ, you're carrying some kind of guilt, regret, shame with you. If you want to be done with that, here's my invitation. Just listen to this song and see if this is the moment. And let me just answer it for you. This is the moment. This is the moment to say, Jesus, I've been wrong and I need to be forgiven because Jesus died on a cross to pay the penalty for our sin, for our guilt, and our shame. If you haven't done that, today's the day. But there's a second group of you, and you're followers of Christ. You said yes to the gift. But for some reason, you are walking with shame in your life. Maybe it's shame that someone needlessly heaped on you. Or maybe it's shame because even though you're a follower of Christ, you're living a life outside the code of honor that Jesus gives. Can I invite you today to ask Jesus to take that shame away? That you might walk in a newness of life. That you might, with all intentionality, say, God, I'm going to fail and limp my way forward. But God, I would ask you to take the sin from me, not just the guilt, but that God would empower you to live an honor-filled life. But it starts today by saying, this is my shame, and I release it today. God, would you take it? Consider those questions as we listen to this.